and welcome. My name is Chrissy and I'm going to share with you some of my favorite tips that I use when working with resin. If you're new here, welcome in. If you've been here before, thank you for tuning in for another video. Now, let me tell you, these are some of the handy tips that I use when working with resin, but I'm keen to hear some of yours as well. Now, let's just get into it. Okay, number one, it's a hot topic. PPE, what do you use, what is it, and when do you have to use it? Let's dive into this because it's a very, very big one that always gets mentioned in the comments, so I'm just going to hit it head on. When we're talking about PPE, it does depend on the resin you're using. There are a multitude of different types of resins, epoxy resins, UV resins, polyaspartic resins, and so on and so forth, okay? When you do arts and crafts, you normally see most people using UV resin or an epoxy resin. Now, depending on your manufacturer, these are manufactured differently with different ingredients inside them. So if you watch a tutorial and you don't use the same resin, it may not even form the way that somebody else's has, okay? So bear that in mind. When you do watch a tutorial, you should, if you want the same result, use the same resin as the tutorial. Now, sometimes that's not possible and you can find resins that are similar, but you should always do your research and read your TDSs and SDSs based around your resin. I want to make that clear. Now, when it comes to our ResiArt, Resi epoxy resins, you don't need to wear a respirator because it is VOC free. Some people say VOX, but it's VOC and it's volatile organic compound. So these are fillers that are put into resin in order to kind of stretch out how much resin you get, and those evaporate and they are not good for your lungs to inhale. So in those cases, yes, you should be wearing a respirator. Whereas the ResiArt epoxy resins are 100% solids, and we do state this on here. So I do just want to hit that. However, yes, make sure you're wearing gloves when working with resin because epoxy or resin rash is a real thing. Long-term exposure to your skin is not good, so make sure you wear the appropriate gloves and make sure you cover your surfaces and all of those things because you don't want epoxy getting everywhere. Next up, let's talk about mixing ratios and how long to mix your resin for. Mixing ratios are super important, and I see a lot of people mix this up a little bit because they get confused or they've gotten advice to add more hardener in order to make it set quicker or any of those things. Here's the thing, right? I'm gonna get nerdy on you. Having more hardener doesn't mean that it's going to make your project set quicker, or it can compromise your project. So essentially, when we say we've got 2 parts of epoxy and then we've got 1 part of hardener, this 1 part of hardener attaches to those 2 parts. Adding more parts of hardener means that hardener has nowhere to attach. Whilst it might still try to attach to the epoxy, it actually changes the chemical makeup, okay? So whilst that's a very nerdy explanation, it's the facts. Don't just add more hardener, make sure your ratios are right. The next really important thing is make sure you stir your resin long enough. Make sure you scrape down the sides and stir. I normally say for your smaller projects, because sometimes it's hard to see the ribbons, I normally say go for about 4 to 5 minutes of stirring and scraping down the sides, not too strong. This really helps with making sure that you're not going to have a sticky finish on your resins. So I hope this makes sense and it's not too complicated, but I think it's really important to get into the actual facts when we're talking about adding a little bit extra hardener or throwing off our ratios. It is important and fundamental to your project lasting and looking great. Okay. Got bubbles. Let's go over bubbles. Bubbles is a big one. Bubbles are so annoying, and it's really about finding the method that works for you and the resin that works for you. So whilst you can use your shallower pore resins, they tend to hold a little bit more of the bubbles, or they not necessarily hold them, but they need a little bit more assistance with releasing them. Whereas if you use your deep casting resins, you find that the bubbles will release a lot easier because it's slowing down the curing process, giving them time to release before the resin cures. So here's a few tips of what I use in order to pop my surface bubbles once they come up to the surface. I prefer isopropyl alcohol, but do be mindful, I do use 99%. I do not want water mixed in with my ISO. So if you can't get your hands on that, another way you can do it is using a heat torch or a heat gun. Just be mindful when using heat torches and heat guns to move quickly over your resin and pull away, because if you spend too much time hovering over your resin, you will burn it, and this is not good. It will ruin your project. So just a quick sweep. If you have to go back and do a second sweep, that's okay, but just don't hover there. Don't hold the heat over it. Obviously, don't use isopropyl and the heat methods together, just separate. One or the other, whatever works for you. There are also pressure pots and other ways in which to help you with the bubble dispersion, but these are just a few tips. Let's move on to the next one. I touched on this briefly earlier. Make sure you cover your surfaces and your floors and everything before you get started. So I've got plastic disposable tablecloths that I use. I use them for a few times and then I throw them away once they get a bit ratty. And I just get a really big one and cut it down to my table. I have builder's plastic on the floor. And another handy tip is while your resin is curing, so once you finish your project, if you've got a container big enough to set over your project, that'll stop any of those things that kind of fly in, or the dust particles. If you have a funny story about this, please let me know in the comments, because I could only imagine the things that could get caught in your resin as it's curing. Next up, timing is everything. A good tip is to plan out what you're going to do before you get started. So kind of working out how much resin roughly you're going to need, and also picking your colors before you mix up your resin. Your resin does have a pot life, so while it's sitting in that pot and you're making those choices, it's starting its curing process. So it's always good to know what colors you want before you get started, and make sure you have everything laying out ready to go. You do not want to waste your resin. So I think this is a big one, because sometimes we get ahead of ourselves and then they're like, oh, but I don't know what color. So good handy tip for that one. Don't add too much pigment. It is really important that you be mindful of how much pigment you have inside your resin. Now, there is a point of too much and you cannot take it out once it's there. So always do little increments and be very mindful of the things that you are mixing in with resin. If you're mixing something that's not recommended, just remember that this can alter the outcome of your project. So just be really mindful as to what you're going to mix in with your resin. Always keep a level handy and make sure your surface is level before you start working with resin. Yes, resin does level, but only to the surface you've created. So make sure your surface is level. Cleanup. Let's go over a few of the ways that you can clean up after you've worked with resin. Now, there's a few ways, and I'm going to try and cover off most of them. If you have other suggestions, please feel free to leave those in the comments too. But for now, I'm just going to tell you that if you have uncured resin and you want to wipe it up, we have handy wipes, or isopropyl alcohol on a rag, wipe it up, that will get it off there. Now, if you're caught in a bind and you don't have any of these things, white vinegar, household vinegar, is really good for cleanup as well. So just in case you're stuck in a bind. Now, there's other ways too. If you want to leave the drips and things like that to cure on your mat, you can always peel them off later. I just peeled these off after they set, and they came off pretty easily. And remember, I said I'm using a disposable mat or a disposable tablecloth, so after a little while will just get rid of it. You'll see it start to look a little bit ratty, and then eventually I'll just throw it out and put in a new one. So that's one of the things that I would say. Now, when it comes to your molds and things like that, I usually use a bit of sticky tape to pull off any resin that's not kind of stuck on there. And I do know some people use warm soapy water to wash them. Just make sure that they are fully dry before you put resin in them again. Please remember that if there is uncured resin on anything, do not rinse it in the sink at all, because it will either cure in your drains or it's going to be really harmful to the environment. So don't rinse it down the sink. Do not do this. Okay, let's move on. Lastly, I want to say be prepared with some smaller molds so that you can make little pieces if you have a little bit of resin left over. Now, if you want to plan it out and try and measure the right amount, that's completely fine, but you may still find you have the littlest bit that you just don't want to waste. So having some small molds handy and just putting your excess in there is always good. You'll see some of the pieces that I've made here just with little bits of leftover resin. These come in handy too, because then you can put them into your projects later on. So something along these lines, where I have put all the little hearts that I made from leftover resin into a trinket tray. You can do lots of fun little things like this. So be mindful that while it feels maybe like a little bit of a waste, you never know what you could create with that. There you go. That is my hot tips for working with resin. Now, I may not have covered off on everything, so let me know if there's something else you'd like to know. Also, if you are a resin artist and you have a hot tip that could work for us, please let us know in the comments. Now, that's all from me, but please make sure to like, subscribe, and check in on our next video. See you then.